Janet Bax is the Canadian government's Director for Emergency Planning. She was formerly an associate or aide of Sheila Copps. And Janet Bax presented a complete map of the world with different regions colored differently, and each region representing a zone of US interest. And she was presenting this map to us as though it were the most natural thing in the world, that the entire planet be one vast series of zones of US interests. And this is an official from the government of Canada who could not possibly have been speaking in an independent capacity. But what of the political parties? What do we have since 1984 and indeed to the present? We, of course, had Brian Mulroney, as we saw, had brought about free trade, though he told the public that he would do otherwise. And from that point onward, Richard Allen, who had served Ronald Reagan as National Security Advisor, his program for Canada was largely implemented. He wrote a memo to Reagan in which he said, we must secure Canada's oil supplies in response to the instability in the Middle East, and we can only do it by way of free trade. And we must be able then to persuade the Canadian public that free trade is an initiative that came from them and not from us. Evidently, he was largely successful. They have secured lucrative oil supplies. Some of the richest oil sands in the world, Dome Petroleum, was sold to Amoco at fire sale prices, and lo and behold, after Mulroney ceased serving in office, he was put onto the board of Amoco, among the other corporations on whose boards he sits. But Jean Chrétien told the public of Canada that he would not ratify NAFTA, which was signed by the Conservative government in '92, but not ratified. He informed the public of this country that he would not ratify NAFTA if we did not get definitions on unfair subsidies and dumping. Well, we got neither, but he went after his election and ratified NAFTA. Subsequently, more Canadian companies have been taken over under Jean Chrétien's regime. There have been more orders in council than under Mulroney's time. That is to say, ruled by decree. The parliamentary process, the democratic process, has been short-circuited in favor of a quasi-presidential rule by the Prime Minister, sanctioned by the Governor-General. They have been very happy to implement all the security measures in lockstep with the US Patriot Act. But perhaps more importantly, they have advanced the cause of control by US corporations over our strategic industries. The railways now, Canadian National Railway, is 75% owned by US industries. The takeover was subsidized to the tune of $2.5 billion, whilst Paul Martin was our finance minister. And of course, the railways determine the trade routes. So now the trade is more the axis of trade is more north-south focused than it is east-west. The east-west links are largely being dismantled if they haven't already. The government of Canada voted at the UN against a resolution that would have had water as a human right, because there are big corporations in the United States that see fit to take over our water. And in fact, the government of Canada is currently being sued to the tune of $10 billion for refusal of bulk water exports, which the United States claims violates the free trade agreement. And you know what? They're probably right. It is probably a violation of the free trade agreement. But at no time did the media really publicize these matters. They simply went on as though, yes, indeed, Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin were governing the country and decisions were made, but there was no explanation as to what underlied those decisions. There was no explanation as to why Chrétien agreed to the Canadian versions of the Patriot Acts, why Chrétien agreed to give the tax information on all Canadians over to the INS in the United States. That did not enter the public discourse, at least not as far as the press was concerned. So it would seem then that Vernon Walter's dictum of the need to take over the media of a targeted nation was put to good effect in this country. But what of the Reform Party, then known as the Alliance, now known as the Conservative Party of Canada? What of that party? What of it? The media did not tell us, unlike Murray Dobbin, who did tell us in his book, Preston Manning and the Reform Party, that the Reform Party enjoyed a close rapport with the Republican International Outreach. That Preston Manning did his university studies at an outfit owned and operated by TRW Corporation, the 16th largest arms manufacturer in the world, maker of Beaumark missiles, maker of Polaris submarines. He did his university training there. His thesis, if one can call it such, had to do with the creation of a vast right-wing political party in Canada. Media never told us that. Media never told us that he went on a tour of duty in Vietnam at the height of the Vietnam War, when the only people who went there were either journalists, they were soldiers, they were medical personnel, or they were spies. And at no time has Manning ever claimed to be a journalist. At no time was he known to have been enlisted in the armed forces. And at no time was he medical personnel. The conclusions, I don't need to draw a connect the dots view. It is largely speculative on my part, I might add. The fact that Chrétien and the Chrétien government was advancing the cause of the use of the US dollar as currency for Canada from the time they took office in '93 was ignored by the media. And I say ignored because I obtained a documentary proof of that. David Anderson was the keynote speaker of the first of the series of conferences that was held in Montreal on November 3rd and 4th, 1994. I got the document over to CBC News, both national and local Montreal, and no one called me back. And in fact, on one occasion, I got very rude treatment with CBC Montreal with a fellow named Wagshall. Why did the media shield that from the public? It is very, very materially important to our nation that our government was having secret talks and secret conferences aimed at getting us to use the US dollar as currency without our knowledge. And it will become an inevitability as our key resources are being sold off at fire sale prices to American interests. It will become inevitable. We will not have the means to back a currency. That fact has also not been brought forward by the media. What of the NDP? At the time of the free trade election of 1988, the first 2 weeks of the campaign was really focused on free trade. That is to say, the Liberal Party of Canada and the NDP really did concentrate on free trade. Lo and behold, shortly thereafter, NDP leader Ed Broadbent at the time saw fit to start attacking John Turner personally. So the discourse shifted from the NDP on the matter of free trade and became focused on the person of John Turner as being the Bobbsey twin of Brian Mulroney. And it was interesting to note that Ed Broadbent's political consulting was provided to him by a Washington-based firm known as Fingerhut Madison. And it is also even more interesting to note that after the election, Ed Broadbent ended up with a $100,000 a year job as head of the Center for Human Rights, a center which appears to have been created largely to put him as the head of it. Appears to have been. Then comes the phenomenon of the Bloc Québécois. At the time of the 1988 election, the government of Canada, of Brian Mulroney, was really at odds with the public. The public as a whole, including the public in Quebec, was very virulently opposed to free trade. But then comes the role of divide and rule. So Mr. Bouchard, who appeared to have split in a rather virulent fashion from Mulroney, started saying that, Meech Lake was a failure. And the timing was interesting. The Meech Lake failure was in 1987. There was considerable hype and emotion stirred up in Quebec by the Quebec media, and it was virulent. I know I'm from there, I can tell you. There were radio talk show hosts routinely denouncing des maudits Anglais. The hysteria was palpable. People really felt that they were betrayed by the close and fall of Meech Lake. But the accord would indeed have balkanized the country to the point where this country would have been ungovernable. Trudeau's critique of the accord was very well founded in law, but his critique was not addressed. The person of Trudeau was attacked, the separatist hysteria was whipped up, and in the cacophony of that whip up, the issue of free trade was obscured in Quebec. And if you look at the breakdown of seats that Brian Mulroney got in the 1988 election, you will note that it was largely on the strength of Quebec that he won the election.